for the work you're doing.
First for breaking news and the best live sport.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
Good morning. It's 9 o'clock. I'm Nikki Campbell, and it's your call. We want your call, your thoughts, your texts for the next hour on this question. Has our food just got too cheap? Well, we've been hearing all the views this morning on this, and it's 0500 909 693. The Environment Secretary Owen Paterson's going to Brussels to discuss the horse meat scandal with his European counterparts. It's been found in a horse meat, in a range of budget meat products, from value range burgers to frozen ready meals. Has our penny pinching forced shops to drive the prices down too far? Or should we just expect proper standards? Shadow Environment Secretary Mary Cray says the system, not consumers, are to blame.
People's incomes are stagnant, in some cases falling, and the price of food is going up faster than inflation. So I've been concerned by people saying, well, it's people's fault for wanting cheap meat. That's not where the problem lies. The problem lies with the system.
Are we paying the price for our love of cheap food, or are supermarkets and suppliers letting us down? If you buy budget meals, is this a case of you get what you pay for? Has food just got too cheap? 0500 909 693. Tweet us at BBC 5 Live. You're with 5 Live from the BBC.
85058. Text will be charged at your standard message rate.
This is BBC Radio 5 Live.
Remember the BSE scandal? People were saying this at the time. This is now the horse meat scandal. Is our food just impossibly, unfeasibly, unreasonably cheap? Is it got too cheap? 0500 909 693. We have Tim Lang, Professor of Food Policy at City University London, who advises the government on food safety. Hello, Tim.
Hello. I used to advise government, not anymore. They don't want me. We
have Tim Lang, Professor of Food Policy at City University London, who used to advise government on food policy, but they don't want him anymore.
That's right.
Joanna Blythman is with us as well, as a food journalist, author of What's to Eat, and very much wanted. Hello, Joanna.
Hello there.
Hi. Ben is in Somerset. He's called us. He's a dairy farmer. Ben, is food too cheap?
Yeah, I think it is, probably. I think it's not necessarily that it's too cheap everywhere across the board, but the cheapest is too cheap.
Yeah. Why has it come to this? Where's the pressure coming from?
Well, I would imagine the pressure in the main has come from the supermarkets, because they are leading customers, obviously, by competing against each other to produce as cheap food as possible. And it comes down to the fact that incomes are low and people want to spend as little as they can on their required food, isn't it? I mean, everyone needs to eat every day, but obviously the cheaper you can do that, the more money you've got for other things. And in times like this, it's especially, it's more important than ever, I think.
Yeah, and, inevitably, corners are getting cut, you reckon?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I produce beef, we did produce sheep, and we produce milk, and we are right at the limit of the cost of production to what we get paid for those products. And, we have a trail from the day they are born to the day they are killed. Everything they eat, everything they are injected with, treated with, anything, everything is recorded, every movement. Well, this costs money, and then, as I said, we produce. What we sell is right at the limit of what we produce it for. Well, if you go and buy something which is cheaper than what we can produce it for, what do you expect? Do you expect it to be have the same standards maintained? I mean, if you don't even know what species it is, how can you know? How can you be sure that animal is being treated or fed, or you just cannot tell what's happened to that animal?
So 80p to a pound for a burger, that's just not realistic.
Well, no, I mean, but then why don't we make them ourselves? If people got out of the habit of buying processed food and instead you bought mince and made it yourself, it's not difficult. Lasagna, it's not a difficult dish to make. I mean, it couldn't be much easier.
Tim Lang, does he have a point?
It does. We're dealing here, I'm sure Joanna will agree, with the legacy of about 200 years in British culture. We have had a food policy and a food system designed around trying to make it ever cheaper. And you're seeing corners cut. And your question you asked at the beginning, there are huge health costs associated with diet. We may have cheap food, but we're getting expensive healthcare. There are huge environmental impacts caused by food. Food is the single biggest impact on climate change that any European consumer has. It accounts for 30% of greenhouse gases. And a lot of that is associated with meat and dairy, and that's a huge problem. So it's too cheap, yes, but there is also a difficulty in this, in that cheap food has been a real advantage for people on low incomes. If you look at the drop in food prices over the last 60 years, it's gone from about 25 to 30% of the average household disposable income, what we spend, down to about 9, 10%. If you include eating out, 12%. That's a huge drop in the proportion of what we spend on food. And that at one level has been fantastic. Even people on low incomes have been able to get more clothes, be able to go on occasional holidays, buy a TV, take their kids out, etc. So there is a very complicated impact of this shift in food and the price and how much money we spend on it. But to come back to your core question, food is too cheap. But it's going to require a culture change, a system change. It's going to require a totally different direction of travel if we really want to sort this out. I personally think we have to sort it out. Yesterday, I was at a major conference of leading people in climate and environment and what we call non-communicable diseases, the diet-related diseases, cancers, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, etc. They're rocketing worldwide. It's not just a British problem.
And if you'd had a drink after it and you'd been on, a few drinks and you'd been on your way home and you passed a kebab shop and you'd been hungry, would you have had a kebab?
Well, I don't. I gave up meat after the BSE. And,
did you? Right.
But I did. I used to be a beef farmer. I'm not worried about. No,
but I'm just saying those kebabs.
Meat.
I was worried about what's in those kebabs.
Well, of course. I mean, so far, the safety issue has not been raised by the horse meat issue. There is this little worrying sword of Damocles, this question mark about whether veterinary drug residues are in that horse meat. Who knows what might come out? But in principle, horse meat is fine to eat as much as beef. It's a cultural issue. It's a moral issue of what you want to eat.
It's a moral issue of knowing exactly what's in it. Let's hear from someone else. Joanna Blythman, your response, and then we'll hear from Michael in Northampton. Sorry. Hello, Michael. Are you there? Just to check you're ready to speak.
Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Michael. Joanna.
Yes. Well, the key thing to understand here is that the supermarkets have encouraged us to believe this myth that it's possible to have mass-produced, industrialized food that's sourced on a global basis and that can still be safe and wholesome. And that myth has been gone along with by government, by the nutrition establishment, who feed us this line that, you don't need to bother cooking any longer. That's fine. We're cool about that. As long as you follow the traffic lights and buy low-cal and low-fat, that's all absolutely right. Now, that is absolutely not the case. What we're waking up to with this scandal now is that you cannot trust processed food. Its very nature is such that it allows so many interventions, technological, so many stages in the food chain for fraud and adulteration that it cannot be trusted. The other kind of key thing for me here is that I would dispute the fact that the supermarkets actually keep the price of food down. What the supermarkets are past masters at doing is having a few products like ultra-cheap burgers or very cheap milk, which create a sort of hot halo of health, a kind of aura of good value around everything they do. But actually, most of the time, they're charging through the nose and making a massive profit. Now, particularly, you see this on fruits and vegetables, which are routinely, every supermarket product is marked up by at least 32 to 40%.
Save your ire, save your fire, and stay with us for a few minutes, because Morrison's are coming on after we've heard from the travel news in a couple of minutes. And they're going to take calls, they're going to take questions, they're going to take a question from you, Joanna, if you can stay with us for a few minutes. Okay. Michael, what's your point this morning? Is our food too cheap?
I believe, well, no, I don't think it's too cheap. If you compare the UK main retailers to mainland Europe, our UK retailers are netting about 5% from food. They'll typically put a 50% markup, maybe 60% sometimes, whereas the European retailers are netting 1 and 1.5%. So their profit aspirations are so much higher than Europe. So the consumer is already paying over the odds in Europe, in the UK, beg your pardon. And I just think if we could maybe actually use some of that money and push that back down the food chain, back to the processors, back to the farmers, back to the people that provide the food for this country, then redistribute the profit line.
As a dairy farmer, Ben, how are the supermarkets, what they like to deal with?
Well, they are stringent, to be honest with you. What happens is, like, particularly at the moment, there are contracts that allow you're a dedicated supplier to a supermarket. Now, what happens is you get paid a premium. However, there's an awful lot, extra stipulations on what you have to do to use whatever product it is. And then you have to fill in loads of paperwork and adhere to all these guidelines. And then they will pay you, at the moment on dairy in particular, they pay you a figure that has been worked out by a Promar, that is another costings agency in agriculture, and they will pay you a margin above that. So if it costs you particularly more to produce it than that, it doesn't matter. The fact is they've got a general figure, and that's how they're going to pay you. And so it looks like from the outside, they'll say, look, we are helping you. We're going to say, look, we're always going to make it that you make a profit from what you're doing. But in actual fact, they're limiting you ever making a good profit. They're just keeping it careful level. So if anything changed, you wouldn't have any safety net because you've not been able to build up reserves.
Okay.
So they're very strict, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, listen, stay there by all means, because Morrison's are coming on in a minute. All credit to them for coming on and taking calls. If you want to put a point to them, Ben, I'll come to you. We'll come to Stephen Bristol in a second, too. It's 9:16, and Joanna Blythman certainly still with us. Morrison's next. Here's Michelle.
This is 5 Live Breakfast. Your call.
Right, Julian Bailey from Morrison's, credit to you for coming on. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Nicky.
Right, do you have a total one, before we get callers to ask you questions, Joanna Blythman has a question for you. We've got Andy here as well. Do you have complete and utter 100% confidence that everything on your shelves is as it says on the packet?
Well, we've had no evidence so far of cross-contamination. We set our business up slightly differently from other supermarkets so that we try and keep things simple. Of course, we're going through a testing programme at the moment with the Food Standards Agency, and we're not complacent about that.
Because Waitrose, it's not cheap, Waitrose, is it? I mean, we found out, Andy, didn't we, Andy Verity, that there were traces of pork in their meatballs. They've taken them off the shelves now.
Yeah, that's right. And one does wonder, Julian, good morning, by the way,
good morning.
How supermarkets are keeping track of the provenance of their meat. Don't you have systems in place which should go right down to the supplier so that you can test, not every burger maybe, but be sure of your supply?
Well, let me tell you how we're set up. We try to make as much fresh food as possible ourselves. In the case of meat, we have our own abattoirs. We literally walk cattle in to the abattoirs ourselves. And we see the trays of meat coming out at the other end. So for the meat that's coming out of our abattoirs, we're absolutely sure that it is what it says it is. Clearly, we can't make all the fresh food ourselves. We don't have the capacity or the capabilities to do that. So we do rely on some suppliers to make things like ready meals. And of course, we audit them very carefully. We ask them lots of questions. We go and visit their factories and make sure that they have the systems in place to produce food that has integrity for customers.
Do you have value burgers?
We do have value burgers.
How much are they? Off the top of your head.
I can tell you, looking at the website here, 2 for a 6-pack of Morrison's fresh British beef burgers, £2.50 each. I mean, it's amazing value, seemingly.
Yeah. What's in them? Do you know?
It's 100% British beef.
Right, but which bits of the British beef or the cow is another question. Let's get some questions to you. I'll come to you in a second, Joanna Blythman, but let's have John in Leeds. John, your point, please.
Yeah, morning, Nicky. I mean, I'm a bit cross with the way this has gone, really. It's absolutely not the consumer's fault. Do not blame the consumer by saying, oh, you're cheap, your food's too cheap. It's about two things. First of all, it's about a lack of, shall we say, security within the food supply network. And secondly, and perhaps most importantly, it's just about, let's take these large, I won't name any, but these large supermarkets, just look at the profits they make. And look at the profits they continue to make in the billions. Maybe they should put perhaps just some of those, maybe a couple of million, into a bit more food security. That's where it lies. It's the supermarkets wanting to maintain their profit margin to take money from us and from the farmers and give it to the shareholders. What the supermarkets are doing, sorry, Nicky, what the supermarkets are doing, quite simply, is they're taking it from both us and the farmers at both ends to maximise their profits.
And Ben in Somerset, as a farmer, just reiterate your point to Julian Bailey, then we'll get a response.
Well, essentially, as I pointed out, the cost to us to produce this, our produce in this country, our produce, by the way, is the most assured produce, the most rigorously tested that there is in the world, and at the end is the best quality as well. I mean, there'd be very little argument to say that we don't produce great quality produce. But we go through these massive, all this pressure, all this rigmarole of producing it, all the assurance, all the paperwork, and we get paid a very tight price at the end. Well, how can we compete if you then go and source products from abroad which are not following these standards and then make value food? I mean, why would people buy the more expensive burger that's been so looked after and so carefully got to at that stage? Why would people spend that money when they've got a cheaper option next to it, which was produced by some factory in Romania, wherever, and is 50% whole?
Right.
Not that your supermarket is involved in that, as we...
All right, but Julian Bailey has a general point there.
Okay, well, I'll take the profitability question first. We make roughly 5 pence in every pound in profit for the food that we actually sell. We think that is a reasonable rate of return. It's a lot less than many other industries. There's been successive competition commissions that have looked at supermarkets to see whether we're making too much money or whether competition is right, and they've concluded that it is about right. So I think in general we make just enough to keep our shareholders happy, and we're certainly not exploiting farmers. I think on the second point, on British produce, I agree with the farmer that you were talking about. We source all our Morrison's own brand meat from British farmers. We think that's the right thing to do, and we think it provides an assurance about welfare standards and about standards of farming. So we agree that British is best.
It's Julian Bailey from Morrison's. Now, Joanna Blythman, what point would you like to put?
Well, I mean, all credit to Julian to come on, for Morrison's to come on this programme when all the other retailers have gone into hiding and are sort of allowing the Food Standards Agency to field the scandal for them. But Julian is very honest, and what he makes is a very important point, that if we're just talking about cuts of meat that are sold as such, then, a supermarket can have reasonable control and certainty that the product is what it is.
Well, what do you make of it, if I can just butt in here, and apologies for interrupting, a 6-pack of value burgers for £2.50?
Yeah, well, what I'm trying to say is, if you're just selling a bit of meat, i.e. steaks or a leg of lamb, then it's much easier to know where something is coming from and how it's being produced. And 40p. Could I finish? I'd love to finish this. If on the other hand, what you're doing is what Morrison's and all the other supermarkets are doing, is putting out to tender processed meat products, then you do instantly lose control. No responsible retailer can really say, hand on heart, we can be absolutely sure what's going into these burgers or to those ready meals. And Julian's made that very clear today. And I think an important point here for the sort of take-home point for all of this is that if you eat whole, unprocessed food, you start from raw ingredients and you mainly cook them yourself, the risk of adulteration and fraud is infinitely reduced. If, on the other hand, you live on these low-quality, low-grade, supposedly cheap, multi-ingredient, heavily processed meals supplied by supposedly responsible retailers, you do not have that guarantee. You cannot be sure that it is either safe or nutritious or healthy.
Yeah, and the point is 40p for a burger. Is that too cheap, or is that the right price?
No, it's ludicrously cheap. But I agree with your last caller who says let's not blame consumers for demanding cheap foods. Consumers have been encouraged to think that it's perfectly possible to eat a product like that and it will be fine. And let's just look at that all of this week, the Food Standards Agency has been jumping up like a parrot saying, of course, this doesn't mean that you need to worry about processed foods. Processed foods are very safe to eat, and it has no right to do that. It has no locus for doing that. It has no evidence to support that, because everything we find out about these mass-produced, highly industrialized, processed foods should make us extremely, extremely suspicious. It's not paranoia. It's just wise and sensible.
Right.
Just don't buy them. Cook your own. As your last caller said,
Julian
how
Bailey.
hard is it to make a lasagna?
Well, we set up our business to work obviously as efficiently as possible to deliver those low prices. We've got a situation, Nikki, here where we've got 2.5 million people that are unemployed, other people that are at or near minimum wage, and I'm sorry, they simply require us to deliver low food prices, and we can be really clear about that. We strongly believe that everyone has the right to eat decent, fresh, affordable food. And I'd like to just take you back to, the 1960s or 70s, before, supermarkets really started to grow. Do we think that customers at that time had the same quality and range of affordable food that they do now? I'm just not sure that many of your listeners would agree.
No, but I'm sure you probably remember, Julian, when you were a kid, you would have the Sunday roast, and that would be a large chunk of your family's weekly income there. The fact that meat is so much cheaper now makes it more widely available, but doesn't it also mean that you, the supermarkets, acting on our behalf, are putting maybe sometimes undue pressure on suppliers who can't really make money rearing cows these days?
Well, I'm not going to defend the whole supermarket sector, but I can speak for Morrison's. There is a groceries code that ensures that we deal with suppliers fairly. We've never had one successful complaint about Morrison's under that code. We regularly come among the top supermarket in surveys of farmers. So we think overall that we treat farmers pretty fairly.
There's a text here, the Morrison, just to respond to it. It may be hugely libelous, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. You can deal with it. The Morrison's guy spinning the truth. The profit is supplemented. All the profit is supplemented by marketing and promotional contributions, markdown allowances, non-return discounts around 8% settlement terms. The true gross profit on food is therefore 25 to 30%, not 5% as he stated. Any truth in that?
Absolute rubbish.
Absolute rubbish. There you go. Thanks for the text anyway. And here is Chris in Lancashire.
Hi, Nikki. I'd just like to ask the gentleman from Morrison's, what are you doing when you go out to tender for processed foods? Are your processed foods purely one on price only, or are there quality systems in place? If not, there should be, because the one thing that Europe is doing is driving up prices through its constant development of standards for this, standards for the other. The producers of the meat, the farmers, etc., are doing their best. And the next time you look in your local paper, just have a see if you can find out the standard rating for hygiene run by some establishments. I don't think you'd eat there if you did.
Well, when we actually go out to tender, we ensure that there are food quality experts and food innovation experts that are actually involved in that process. We have a kitchen here at Morrison's headquarters, and we literally sort of cook everything ourselves to actually see what it turns out like, how it tastes, what the standards are. And we have a very large technical and compliance department which looks at the standards at which our suppliers work to us.
So now you're telling me, yes, you are checking the standards, but ultimately, who wins the tender will be based on price alone?
No, that's absolutely not true. If we have any doubts about the quality of the product, then it's absolutely not about price.
Right, thank you.
Here's a point that actually addresses your point, Joanna Blythman, and it's a text. Are you still with us, Joanna?
I am.
It says, Carol in Bristol. It's from Kevin Watford. 6 value burgers at £2.50. I made 5 burgers with a pound of mince from my butcher with an onion, some salt and pepper for £3, a bit of effort. And I know which ones I would want my child to eat. That's singing from your hymn sheet, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. And I'm fascinated to hear Julian from Morrison's sort of portraying the supermarkets as almost charitable institutions who are doing this noble job of giving, struggling people with low budgets affordable food. What he needs to make clear is that they're squeezing their suppliers to give them the lowest price, but the supermarkets are taking no reduction in their profits in order to give people a better deal. So that's quite. In fact, they're quite rapacious. They will just say, "I want this product made cheaper. That's all we'll pay you for it. If you can do that, you'll get the business.
Rapacious.
If not, forget it."
All right, rapacious. A final point for you, Julian.
No, we are, we're a business. Of course, we have to strike tough deals with our suppliers. Many of those suppliers are not farmers. They're, big businesses just like ours. And we do what we do for customers. So, no, I disagree with that term, obviously.
And just one last text for you. Is Morrison's frozen meat and meat products all British?
Many frozen products. It depends what you're talking about, Nikki. If you're talking about, for example, our frozen burgers, they're British. With processed foods, clearly some food will come from overseas.
All right. Thank you very much for coming on. Julian Bailey from Morrison's. Our question this morning, our core question on Your Call, is our food too cheap? It's 9:31. Here's Simon. Thanks, Andy.
Nikki, thanks for...
Is our food too cheap? Here's Adam Garrett. Adam Garrett writes the food blog, thebritishmenu.com. Hello, Adam.
Hi, Nikki.
And here's Tony in Pontefract and Steve in Bristol and Jeffrey in Oldham. Steve, have we spoken to you yet? I can't remember.
No, you haven't, Nikki.
Oh, what's your point?
The guy from Morrison's played the card. They're serving the people on low income. And then you had a text saying about burgers costing £3 to make a load of burgers. We've changed our lifestyle, how we eat at home recently. Not because it is, because of something else. And if you took all those processed foods off the shelf tomorrow, would the country be better off? Yes, they would, because people would go back to cooking food properly and finally going back to that joint of beef in the 70s. I can remember that joint of beef in the 70s, and it used to last us 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, it did, yeah.
And you don't need processed food. What's happened is somebody invented a piece of processed food, they trialled it, it worked, and now the supermarkets are all having battles between each other who can do it the cheapest. It is as simple as that. It's economic.
When we do cook, we cook the turkey at Christmas. We make that last, that lasts for 2 weeks, doesn't it? The soup and till Easter. Yeah, that's right. Mike in Manchester, what do you say to Steve?
Well, I run my own small business, and I've got nothing but admiration for the supermarkets. I think they're tremendously efficient. They help feed 60 million people on a regular basis, and we've got to look at ourselves, because supermarkets are only a result of convenience. We drive to supermarkets, we do a shop. I walk around the supermarkets, and I never think that the supermarkets, whatever they sell, are going to poison me. At the end of the day, yes, on the cheapest cuts and the cheapest products, they've had a problem. Someone's put horse in instead of beef, and that is terrible and that is wrong. But at the end of the day, they do a very, very good job. They're not poisoning people on a regular basis. What's the problem?
I completely agree with what you just said. The issue is, yes, they do provide a service. They do all these other bits and pieces. If they took all those processed foods off the shelves, all their other stuff would sell. They would actually sell more of fresh vegetables. They would sell more cuts of beef, everything else. And I completely agree with you. We go to the supermarket every week.
Yeah, they would, but it's people's choice. I buy fresh food, but I also buy convenience food, because sometimes my wife works, I work, we get home, we don't want to cook fresh food. At the end of the day, that's our choice. We're fortunate that we can afford to buy what we want in the supermarket. I don't buy the cheapest burgers, I don't buy the cheapest cuts, but I am fortunate. I understand, though, that there's 60 million people living in the country, and some people have to buy the cheapest food. Now, at the end of the day, if you were a third world country listening to this conversation, you'd think we've all gone insane. Yeah, some people have eaten horse as well as beef. Big deal. At the end of the day, I don't eat red meat, and obviously I'd be upset if red meat got into a vegetarian meal that I was going to eat. But all I can say is the supermarkets are getting a lot of heat on this. But it's not just the supermarkets; it's a stakeholder thing. We should all take responsibility for it. If you buy something that's cheaper than it should be, then there is a risk. There shouldn't be, but there is a risk.
What would happen is, if you took those processed foods off I agree with virtually what you said, but if you took those processed foods off the shelf, and apart from that, if you going back to Nikki's lump of beef, that you could have.
It's very nice of you to say so. Carry on.
That's okay. You can cook that on a Sunday and make 2 or 3 meals for the next couple of days. You won't have that pressure to, what we're going to make the following day. But if you took the processed foods off and add the fresh fruit and vegetables, the sales of those will go up, which means the money, the cost of those will go actually down, because the supermarkets will be competing against each other. Who got the cheapest meat?
Who's ready to say something? Hey, wait a minute. I heard somebody saying I'm ready to say something. Who was it?
Yeah, Jeff. It's Nicky. Good morning. It's Jeff in Manchester. I don't know what those two guys work in, but I've worked in the baking industry for the last 23 years, and it's a vicious circle. It's the supermarkets that are making the money out of this, and not the people who work making the products for the supermarket. The stakeholder things are nonsense. Over the last 10 to 15 years, the wages of the people in this country have been suppressed, and we're falling further and further and further behind inflation all the time. I can't honestly remember the last time that I had a pay rise that was anywhere near inflation or above inflation, which means we're falling behind. That then makes people go out and look to buy cheap food, and the supermarkets are making billions of pounds. I could sit here, Nicky, all day and tell you horror stories of how many bakeries have closed in this country, yeah? It's gone abroad because the supermarkets have put that much pressure on the suppliers that they run themselves into the ground.
All right, I wonder if that's the problem. Adam Garrett, let's bring you in, Adam. Supermarkets, are they part of the problem, part of the solution? Is food too cheap? What's causing the problems?
Well, I think firstly, I think supermarkets do have their place, and obviously everybody uses them. They are a convenience. But I think food has sort of become more of a commodity rather than something that should actually be treasured and respected. I think in a lot of ways we're eating worse off than what we did in the 1940s during the Second World War. I mean, back then it was a case of you may do. I mean, a chicken was a chicken back then. A chicken now has been pumped full of water and proteins to bulk it out to make profit. And I think, with a bit of knowledge and a bit of understanding about what we eat and how we prepare food, it can go a long way. I mean, cheap food's always been around. It's always been there in front of us. And if people just took time and just sort of learnt a few skills to cook these cheap cuts, beef mince, chuck steak, flank, pig cheeks, lamb shanks, brisket, all cheap cuts, and you can make such a fantastic meal out of this, and it doesn't have to cost the earth. Just because 8 burgers cost £1 doesn't mean that you should go out and buy them. Buy 4 better quality ones and have something else,
Nicky, can I just come back to you, please?
Let's bring Tony and Pontefract in. On you go, Tony.
Yeah, hi there. Good morning. Good morning, gentlemen. A couple of points, if I may. You cut back in hospitals, people die, services suffer. You cut back, or does any supermarket that sells a pair of jeans for £3, how on earth can they do that? It's because people at the end of the chain, I was going to say food chain, people at the end of the chain suffer. Your children get exploited. You sell food ridiculously cheap. It's not the best food in the world. I mean, people are saying about cooking, cook this, cook that. Most young people today that are buying food they can just about follow the instructions on a snack pot. They can't cook. They've stopped cooking. They've stopped teaching cooking. The cooking programs on TV, we're inundated with them, but it's all fancy cooking. It's all chopping cooking. We need basic, we need basic cooking courses put back into the school. The amount of animals that suffer is staggering. A couple of months ago, and you probably know this, your part of the world, Nicky, up in Scotland, Vion, a massive food processing company, sacked and got rid of 1,700 people from a small area near Livingston. And they're doing the same with all the other meat processing plants in England. All their work, all their processing is going over to Holland, where the restrictions are a lot less than Britain. That's 1,700 people. Most farmers in Scotland have got to ship all their animals now south, long journeys. Yeah. We have no concept of what's happening with our food, and the supermarkets do. Well, for want of a better phrase, doers. I was a truck driver for a while. I did a live lift of chickens against my better judgment. I only did it once. I got to the farm in Yorkshire, and hundreds of these chickens in this shed. It was horrendous. Hundreds of the chickens were dead. They were just carcasses on the floor. They were picked up and put in with the live chickens. They went in with the food processing. And something we're not mentioning is, what about the halal meat? system. The way they slaughter their beasts is horrendous. Nobody's mentioning them.
Do you want to mention that, Adam Garrett? Do you want to mention methods of slaughter and welfare?
Well, obviously, I think it stands to reason that obviously I would probably know more than the average shopper about how this, meat is slaughtered and how it's processed, because it's what I sort of look at, and it's what I do in my spare time. But I think for the average consumer, I think they're removing themselves further and further away from how meat is produced.
We have to reconnect. Let me ask you in a moment how we reconnect, if indeed that is what we have to do. Stay there. Here's Michelle in Edinburgh. Sarah, is our food too cheap?
Of course it is, and particularly when it comes to meat. You cannot breed, fatten, slaughter 1 billion animals as we do in this country every year and expect high welfare standards, no matter how many ministers and, for instance, Anne McIntosh, of the chair of the Environment and Rural Affairs yesterday, kept saying we have the highest welfare standards. You go undercover anywhere, take film, try and get it up, try and get the media interested. Nobody really wants to know, because the reality is you cannot breed, fatten, slaughter.
Well, it's see no evil, hear no evil, isn't it?
It really is. And the fact is, people want meat 3 times a day. They want their bacon sarnie for breakfast, they want their chicken bun for lunch, and then they want their beef curry for dinner. And the scams have, particularly in the meat industry, which is, of course, more dangerous than if you have a bad apple. You can see a bad apple and you can, throw it away or not buy it in the supermarket. But with meat, it's much more difficult to see. And Joanna Blythman is forever saying, buy local, go local. The idea that your local butcher is necessarily a paragon of virtue is different from everyone else. They're good, bad, and indifferent farmers. They're good and bad, different butchers. And you basically have no idea what you're buying.
Unless you are lucky enough to have the money to buy organic. That's the point, isn't it?
No, but even organic. How do you know it's organic? I buy organic carrots. I am assuming they are organic.
All right, Shona, let's move it on. Shona in Edinburgh. Thank you so much, Sarah. Shona in Edinburgh. Be prepared if Pope does make that statement in English. I will have to interrupt. But Shona, on you go.
Well, I agree with most of what everybody else has been saying, and but basically, I don't think the food is too cheap. I think it's a question of actually buying the right things. And the man who said that he bought his own mince and made his own burgers is quite correct. And we should all be doing that. It's a great shame that Delia has given up because her cookery and her food programs were actually the best you could get. People were able to follow her recipes. She gave proper instructions, and it was sensible. The man who said that the programs nowadays are just entertainment. They're not for cooking, but they should be. The BBC are missing a trick if they don't have somebody like Delia on showing people, because now
basics. Everybody
wants to know how to make a simple stew or a casserole or some mince and tatties or whatever, burgers. They should be able to do it for themselves. I know Morrison's sell very good quality, good price, cheap mince, because it's the offcuts, and you can make a very good, nutritious meal for practically nothing if you go to Morrison's and buy sensibly.
Your thought on that, Adam?
Well, absolutely. Totally in agreement. I think more people should be making a conscious effort to sort of make and prepare their own food.
But how do we get that in? How do we get that in process? If you'll pardon the pun, how do we change attitudes? Do we need to get people to reconnect? And if so, how do you do it?
Well, I mean, obviously,
now's the moment.
Supermarkets are here to stay. They're not going anywhere. So I think that the line between the sort of local producers and the supermarket needs to be thinned out. We need, as supermarkets go on about traceability and sourcing and, oh yes, we know that this has come from this farm. But to me, putting a picture of a farmer in Wellies on a packet doesn't cut it for me. I know that when I go to my butcher, I know what I'm getting, where it's come from, even the name of the cow if I so wish. So I think, that line between supermarkets and the local producers needs to be thinned out, and I think traceability is incredibly important. If you know where your animal's coming from, you know what's going in your body.
Can I just ask also, what's wrong with horse meat anyhow? Let's face it.
Nothing. I've had it before. I've eaten it. It's delicious.
Correct.
But that's not the point, is
meat
it?
And they're used
The point is correct labelling.
Yeah, exactly.
If you want to eat horse meat, I'm sure...
If they've been used to eating it and they want something cheap, well, why not just label it correctly and let's get on with it?
Certain people have a cultural problem with it, but that's another issue,
Well, that would
almost.
be their choice, wouldn't it?
But I just want to say as well quickly that an idea that I had as well is that we've got technology in our hands to sort of to prove traceability. I mean, we've probably all heard about the QR barcode. Why don't they stick that on the packets? You scan it with... People have smartphones. They can scan that. They can see the farmer's name, where the farm is, what breed of animal it is, and get all the information they can possibly need about that animal without going to extreme lengths. You know, it's a small barcode, fits on a packet. It's an easier solution.
Anne's in Northern Ireland. Hello, where are you, Anne? That's a bit non-specific.
Oh, yes. Good morning, Nicky. I'm here. We're down by the sea, Castle Rock.
How lovely.
Good morning.
How lovely. I bet there's some lovely golf down there.
There is indeed, but I don't play myself, no. Unfortunately.
What's your point this morning?
Well, my point is, as I said before, married life of 32 years and cooking for a family, and I do see a big difference over the years in our supermarkets, even more recently in the past 5 years, is there's far, far too many aisles of freezers of frozen food. That is the one complaint that I would really make. Even recently, one of our local smaller supermarkets was renovated, and I went in because I always liked it. There was always lots of fresh meat to choose from. I was very disappointed because there was less fresh, and they had brought in more pre-packed, frozen, ready meals. And this won't do any harm, this coming out, because I think people really need to get back to basics, to good old family cooking. That's what my point is this morning.
Well, if you were cooking for the country, we'd be fine, but not everybody can do it.
Well, it's the young ones I feel for, because if you take... I mean, I had 4, they were students, and you taught them to try and make something fresh to eat, try to have something. A lot of young people out there don't know any other way but getting something and putting it into a microwave oven.
No, that's it.
And I feel that if you can go out and lift a lasagna for £1 and a packet of cigarettes is near £10, there's just something amiss.
That's an excellent point. An excellent point. Polly,
and if you see the price of drink and you see the price of cigarettes, but there's not enough education
it's out of kilter
in this country about what we put into our mouths. There's not enough about food. I went to catering college many years ago for 2 years, and that has stood by me in rearing a family and cooking.
You make some excellent points. Polly's in London. Good morning, Polly. Go ahead.
Good morning, Nikki. I think the wrong food is too cheap, and I agree completely with some of the speakers who say that it's this relentless pressure to keep prices down, especially meat. And, you know, you have to ask yourself how it's reared and where it comes from. I'm a great advocate of soup. I ask myself whether a lot of people who are hard up, do they even own a massive, great big pot that they can make a fabulous minestrone with a bit of cabbage and a small tin of tomato puree and some deliciously caramelized onions and
do you know one of the joys of my life, Polly? Do you know one of the joys of my life is at Christmas when I make the turkey. I love making turkey soup.
Turkey soup, I so agree. And I put a bit of orange peel in and a bit of lemon peel.
Really?
And, you know, people don't know these little skills. And the bay leaves and the thyme from the garden or from wherever you can nick it when you're passing by somewhere. And to be honest,
are you advocating stealing time?
Sorry,
you said you nick time from passing by somewhere. Did you say?
Well, I'm just saying, you know, if you haven't got a herb, then just snap a twig off when you're passing one. You know, not that I'm advocating crime, but anyway, the thing is, the best programme would be to follow
middle-class crime
a middle-aged lady and say, what are you cooking for dinner tonight? We're coming home with you and we're going to watch.
Yes.
That's a programme to watch.
Chris in Huntington, make a very quick point. You've got 40 seconds.
Hello, Vic. Good morning to you. Our food in this country is not cheap, it's expensive. I have a home in France, and I can assure you the French food system is much cheaper. Our food in France is much cheaper, the quality is much better. Our meat product is far better in France than it is in this country, purely because they don't stress the animals when they move them miles and miles and miles from Aberdeen to somewhere else in the UK to slaughter. When in France it's within 10 to 15 miles. You know, we're not being ripped off, we're being ripped off on quality, and that's what it's all about. Our food is not cheap, it is far from cheap, believe me.
There we are. Very good points, interesting points. Thanks, Chris. It was worth it. Thanks for hanging on the line there. The the Pope is making a very long speech. Got to be careful here. I think he's still talking Italian. But when he talks in English and gives the reasons for his resignation in English, we'll bring them to you on 5 Live. Victoria's next.